This is a paper where we're trying to set out a broad framework for thinking about the social aspects of negative emissions technologies. Both Holly and I come from a base in geography, but also a base in a field known as science and technology studies, that is a field that deals directly with questions about the interaction between science, technology and society. And I guess if you wanted to sort of take a take-home message from the presentation today, it's really a plea for a wider engagement between developments in negative emissions technology development and the wider social sciences and humanities. So in a way, the paper starts with what I think is a kind of apparent paradox in the discussions over negative emissions. So on the one hand, it's, and we've heard about this over the last 2 days, that questions of a societal nature, often framed as questions of public or social acceptance, and there's a whole range of ways in which that terminology is articulated, they're often regarded as critical to the success or otherwise of negative emission techniques. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that the social sciences and humanities are not well represented in some of the more landmark assessments of negative emission techniques that have been published recently. So this I think is an interesting paradox that I hope we can address going forward, particularly as conversations develop here in Australia and more broadly. So to substantiate this claim, let's look at a couple of examples. Perhaps you can read some of these slides I've got here. So this is the National Academy's report, really making a fairly familiar kind of claim that social acceptance, and particularly around large-scale deployment, is a sort of critical dimension for thinking about negative emission technologies. Recall this is a document that aimed to, in a sense, marshal out a research agenda for the development of a whole range of negative emission technologies. But of course, what's interesting about this report is to some degree the lack of engagement with the social sciences and humanities. So you have, in this case, an agronomist and a lawyer. Now that's important. It's excellent that those particular scholars were part of the working group for this particular committee. But we might make the point that there's a wider range of insight and knowledge that might be relevant for thinking about thinking about negative emissions. Again, not to be too sniffy about this, but let's look again at the Royal Society report. Interestingly enough, the Royal Society is a society that has a really interesting track record of engaging with social scientists, my colleagues included. Again, making very similar kinds of claims about the need to pull together social scientists, economists, the public and policymakers. And does a little bit better, I think, just in terms of sheer numbers, in terms of the percentages, but again, an economist and a geographer. So I'm happy, I'm a geographer, there's another geographer on the list, but of course I think we might make the point that there's a wider array of discipline and perspectives and insights that are relevant to making sense of these developments. Now, of course, this is not necessarily to criticise either the Royal Society or the National Academy process. And of course, these reports are, in a sense, part of an ongoing conversation, part of a developing sort of conversation amongst a range of different scholars. But I think it does underlie the point that there is scope for a wider level of engagement. I think this matters because of the way in which much of the conversation around negative emissions seems to carry with it a set of often implicit assumptions about the nature of the social. So on the one hand, we've said the questions of social acceptance and public perceptions and governance are widely regarded as critical, but the ways that these social questions are dealt with in many of these assessments tends to be relatively limited. So there's a kind of code for the way in which the social is sort of articulated in many of these assessments. Questions of scaling up, questions of the development of incentive systems, questions of payments for carbon sequestration, without really, I think, a sufficient engagement with the incredible depth of scholarship across these areas of contemporary environmental practice that I think could be very usefully built into some of these broader assessments. Then we also have a kind of language here that presents the social as either a barrier or as a solution. So you have this sort of sense that social acceptance constitutes a kind of precondition, or in a sense, a solution that will enable the development of socially robust forms of negative emission technologies. I think there's a very resilient sorts of frames that we see in many different areas, but the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a wealth of research that underpins a body of scholarship on these areas that I think needs to be more sufficiently reflected in these broader assessments. So what does this mean? I think there's some kind of resilient frames here that I think we need to kind of carefully think around. So questions of social outcomes, particularly in questions around climate change, negative emissions, and geoengineering more broadly, tend to be located or tend to be framed as being relevant at the point of deployment, as I said before, as either a barrier or as an enabler. What we see here is a sort of selective take-up of some forms of social science insights, economics, law, occasionally psychology, occasionally geography, at the expense of others. Or perhaps other forms of disciplinary perspectives are a kind of oversight here. And I think what I'm trying to argue for is for a broader platform of engagement. Crucially, I think this kind of logic in some of these reports underpins a relatively linear model of communication, extension, and diffusion. The assumption being that this is simply a communication problem. The social acceptance is a kind of binary yes/no kind of logic, and if we just get the terminology right, we can debate, whether it's carbon dioxide removal or greenhouse gas removal or negative emissions, with all that sort of debate about communications. The assumption there is if we just get that right, that public acceptance will sort of flow as a relatively binary proposition. Lots of research in this field suggests quite the opposite, that public acceptance is always conditional, always contingent. We need to find ways of dealing with that in our assessments. Crucially, I think that much of this discourse is framed by a very narrow conception of social change. Social change is driven, I think much of the thinking here is driven by notions of incentives, extension, and communication. Really, in a sense, a very narrow understanding of how social change happens. I'll explore at the end of the presentation, if I have time, some work in kind of the humanities, thinking about the role of the arts and the role of culture in propelling social change. I think it's a really important area of thought in this space. And crucially, I think there's a sort of sense in which there is a set of under-examined societal assumptions, tacit assumptions, that are ever present throughout the negative emissions discourse that we need to sort of attend to and be much more kind of critically aware of. I think what's interesting about this is that this is to some degree at odds with the direction of travel for major areas of science policy. I'm looking here at Claire, who was involved in developing the Oxford principles that really articulated a more integrated kind of model of thinking about the role of public participation, public engagement, public value in the early stages of the development of geoengineering technologies. This was again reflected in the Royal Society report in 2009 that again made very similar kinds of arguments. That a research governance framework is required as a sort of part of the development of this technology or this suite of technologies. So these are, in a sense, interesting kind of precursors to our current debates in negative emission technologies. I think there's things we can learn from these models that are really calling for a kind of a shift in the site for social science and public engagement, a shift, as it were, upstream into a kind of the development pathway itself, rather than just seeing the site of engagement as a deployment problem. However, I think there are some reasons why we might want to think carefully around some of these models of upstream public engagement or responsible innovation, as it's often framed in many contexts, are broadly framed as models of technology assessment that come out of a whole history of technology assessment in different contexts. I think in negative emissions, the area of negative emissions some areas lend itself to that kind of analysis, particularly developments that are explicitly technological. But as we've seen, many of the things we've been talking about are practice-based. So how do we govern practices and how we govern technologies, I think, are quite different. So I think we need to think more carefully about how applicable these models of responsible innovation are specifically for negative emission techniques. And what Holly and I are arguing for in this paper is for a more systemic socio-ecological sensibility. So what do we mean by that? Well, this is, as Holly suggested to me in the edits for this paper, rather arbitrary list, and so all lists are a product of both their limitations and their extent, as it were. So this is just a back-of-envelope sort of list of things we thought were relevant for today's discussion. I think we developed this sensibility by attending to and by understanding what we call socio-technical imaginaries. Broadly speaking, what's in a name. We understand that we developed this sensibility by thinking about the interpenetration or the co-constitution of climate policy and climate futures. I'll talk about that in a second. Crucially, I think we're trying to develop a language here around a landscape approach to negative emission technologies. What kind of scale of analysis is necessary to approach these topics? And lastly, if I get time, to address questions around the role of the arts and the humanities in this space. Okay, so firstly, what's in a name? So this is just a list of words that I've heard today and the last few days of these will be very familiar to all of us. Negative emission techniques, technologies, interesting sort of distinction there. Carbon dioxide removal, greenhouse gas removal, BECCS, carbon drawdown, carbon utilisation, sink enhancement, sink and balance, reversing climate change is an interesting sort of claim, landscape restoration or landscape regeneration, green, brown, blue, black even carbon. Now these are kind of terms that also have a kind of resonance in the broader world, right? You can buy a can of ale that's based on the crop Kearnes, developed by the Land Institute in the US. Its marketing claims to have a kind of carbon negative effect, similar to this product here, macaroni and cheese, that claims to have a kind of carbon reduction possibility. So this is both a kind of technical set of discussions, but it is also a kind of wider societal and cultural discussion. So in a sense, these terms kind of mark what we might call in the social sciences the discursive terrain of a field of discussion. So what we're engaged in here is a kind of working out of the cultural meaning of these ideas and these techniques and technologies. But crucially, I think the debate within the broader field of assessment of negative emissions technologies commonly thinks about these terminological issues as primarily a communication issue. So it's about getting accurate terms that describe these technologies appropriately, thinking about the likely public uptake of these terms, which term will better resonate with politicians or publics, which term will allow us to garner more or less political leverage. I think this is a very limited frame for thinking about these kind of more discursive kind of areas of discussion. In the area that I work in, we commonly use the word imaginaries. It's not to suggest that it's just a sort of figment of your imagination, but it's really to make the point that implicit in definitions, what my colleague Sheila Jasnov and her colleague Kim call imagined forms of social life and social order. There are conceptions of the social, assumptions about how society works, implicit in the way we talk about and frame negative emission technologies and techniques. And these contending definitions are often underpinned by different societal sort of imaginaries. So getting it right, as it were, it's not simply a matter of getting it right in terms of technical accuracy, but there are deep societal questions at play. So, for example, negative emissions as a terminology leaves open questions of residual emissions. This is very different for folks engaged in questions around regenerative agriculture, a very different kind of ethos, a very different kind of image. So, and I hesitate to put this up because, again, all graphs invite conversations about where the lines are drawn. And of course, this is very arbitrary typology, so apologies for that. But this is just an initial attempt to sort of marshal out some of the different sort of imaginaries that characterise the discussion over negative emissions, and their different kind of modes of thinking about the sort of the way society will respond to these technologies, or the mode of engagement, what we've called here. So, for example, we've heard a lot about a kind of an imaginary of technological optimization. This is particularly evident in the areas of direct air capture or BECCS and biochar. This is about a form of technology development that's imagined or it's sort of depicted as being managed through processes of technology diffusion and governance, particularly through formal processes of public consultation and assessment. This is the sort of very much the default language that populates reports such as the Royal Society report or the National Academy report. But in comparison, we also hear in this space a very different kind of language, a language of ecological restoration. It's commonly associated with a whole area of soil carbon, blue carbon to some degree as well, sink enhancement, the 4 pour mille initiative, afforestation. So here there's very different kind of images and discourses around society. This is about, to some degree, recovery and restoration of some lost carbon landscape. There's a kind of interesting kind of dealing out here with a set of historical reference points. So we heard this morning about restoring carbon concentrations to a level that would equate to before European settlement. This sort of marking out of a historic reference point as a baseline for thinking. And again, the mode of engagement here is again very different. In place of formal processes of technology management and governance, we hear much stronger talk of carbon financing, crediting and incentive systems. But we also hear, to some degree, kind of questions around the role of farmer-to-farmer engagement networks and a range of different kind of models in that space. We also hear a lot more talk about a kind of cultural project here, a cultural representation of restored landscapes. The third kind of imaginary that I think is strong in this space is the logic of ecological enhancement. This is very interestingly linked to notions of fertilization, fertilization being in a sense an enhancement of pre-existing ecological processes, ocean fertilization, enhanced weathering. So here the kind of the societal logic here is around intent, right? And intent matters. The difference between enhancement and pollution hangs on what you're intending to do. It's a very interesting sort of philosophical problem, again, pointing to Claire's work. And again, the kind of the logic of engagement or the mode of engagement here is again through formal processes, but in this case, organised at an international level rather than through, in a sense, nation-based forms of technology assessment. So this is a typology which necessarily draws arbitrary distinctions, and of course, we might debate where things lie, we might, as it were, develop different categorizations, and so the point here is not to, in a sense, get it right, but to, in a sense, show two things, that the way we talk about negative emissions matters, that our default imaginary of this as being a project of technological optimization governed by formal processes of technology governance is only one of a number of imagined scenarios here. And I think we need to, in a sense, work through the way in which these definitional issues kind of matter for how we think about the way in which these techniques interface with their social context. How am I going for time? 2 minutes. Okay, I've got 2 minutes and 7 slides, so I'm going to be really quick. Okay. I won't go through this in detail, except to say that another area of work in this space is around what we think of as the co-production of climate policy and climate futures. We've heard a lot about the shift from AR4 to AR5 and the way that negative emissions emerged in that conversation around the shift from emission scenarios to representative concentration pathways. This is obviously a really broad area of discussion. And why does this, I won't go through this in detail, but why does this matter? Well, what we've heard about in the workshop is the way in which these sort of global assessments or global models of climate are translated into nation-based infrastructures of carbon accounting and finance. This is particularly relevant, for example, in the US, the translation of the dayset model into Comet Farm Tool as part of the basic infrastructure of carbon financing in the area of soil carbon sequestration. A very different kind of model articulated here in Australia around legislated methodologies for the award of carbon credits. Obviously a big area of kind of regulatory sort of development here in Australia. Now this matters, I think, because of some of the things we've heard over the last few days. So we've heard, for example, that one of the areas of emerging development in this space is future developments in precision agriculture and notions of sort of real-time kind of monitoring and verification of carbon uptake in agricultural systems. This matters because of the broader context of data ownership and data concentration. Just to indicate two particular, this is a very long quote which I won't read, but just two particular findings that indicate a broader kind of context for some of this work is that questions of ownership and transparency and control are widely acknowledged in the area of precision agriculture as areas of a significant challenge. This is the first finding was an agreement framed between the US Farm Bureau and major agri-tech providers that really tried to work out questions of data ownership and data sharing. Again, a CSIRO report noted very recently the questions around data ownership were really crucial for thinking about the prospects for new forms of sort of real-time agriculture kind of monitoring. Now, this is not to suggest that these are, as it were, problems that we can't work through, but it's to note that these developments are always situated in a wider social and political context that we need to attend to, that we need to think carefully about, and that our kind of conceptions of the prospect of negative emissions technologies are always conditioned by these wider dynamics. The third area that we wanted to sort of develop here was a question or a conception of carbon landscapes. So one of the notable aspects of assessments of negative emission technologies is the scale at which they are assessed. And it's interesting, I think, to note that's the end point. Okay, great. Okay. Just to finish, two points. So the scale at which we assess negative emission technologies tends to be either at the global level or at the project level. So the ERF system here in Australia assesses projects on a project-by-project level. I think there's real scope for a landscape scale of assessment to really bring into focus the different ways that negative emission techniques and technologies interact with each other. And the last thing to note before I finish is the role of the arts. If we're thinking about burial, carbon burial itself is a deeply cultural practice. Around Yucca Mountain, around seed vaulting, it's notable that those projects have enjoyed a really interesting engagement with the arts. The question here for us is, what kind of artistic practice do we need, or what kind of cultural practice do we need to be thinking about around negative emissions? It's interesting, for example, that the writing of Wendell Berry and Aldo Leopold seems to be back on the cultural radar. So in a sense, there is a kind of cultural project going on here. And last but not least, just to acknowledge the ARC. Thanks very much.